I think. Okay, and as the message you might have just heard, the presentation will be recorded, and the panel today is about poverty and climate change, and we'll finish at 12:30. So we have roughly 40 minutes from now. For this session, we wanted to attract papers that discuss the impact of climate change on living standards and relocation, and also papers on environmental sustainability, on the environmental sustainability of poverty reduction strategies. As you know, this panel has been organized by the DSA Multidimensional Poverty and Poverty Dynamics Working Group, which I'm here to represent. And we also, it's also been organized by the editors of the Journal of Poverty and Social Justice, that is myself and Joe Mack. We really don't have that much time, to be honest, so I'm going to begin straight away. And so I will ask each presenter to answer one question, because as you know, the presentation has been available for quite some time, and so has the paper. So these questions have emerged from the review of the paper by the DSA Multidimensional Group, as well as the editorial board of the Journal of Poverty and Social Justice. If you think there are overlaps within the papers, it will also be interesting to hear your thoughts, but I guess the idea is to make it interesting straight away and ask you some precise question rather than wait for the audience. That said, at the end of that kind of exercise, I will open up to the audience and ask them, basically open up to the floor in case there are any questions. So I'd like to start with the paper by Nariyaz Zivda, and this and from the United Nations. So the paper examines the water-related climate change impacts and injustices for the urban poor in Tehran, and is revisiting the role of civil societies for climate adaptation, which is, I think, a very interesting theme, which is actually suggested as a key solution. This is a rich, in-depth case study of Tehran, which, as I said, we found very interesting. So the question that I have is that we were wondering, and there was also a related question by Sam Pickett on the presentation platform. If you could comment a little bit more on a couple of things. One, the community-based water system that once existed, and what was the role of the MIRABs, and why the shift in responsibilities to governmental bodies has caused problems. And then linked to that, whether you think there could be a way of basically bringing back this kind of community-led governance and to maybe re-emerge perhaps in partnership with the government. Over to you now.
Thank you very much for leading this, Marco, and thanks to you and Sam for the question. I would just say a few words about the previous arrangements in Tehran with regards to water resource management. When we look at the previous water management in Tehran, we would notice that actually they were based on a kind of independent, semi-governed, community-based systems. But in the modern era, when the city now depends on both the traditional infrastructure and tap water, now all the responsibilities and the ownership of the traditional systems are handed over to the government authorities, and basically the municipality of Tehran and the authorities working under the umbrella of government, who look at the water as a kind of commodity rather than human right. But MIRAB, as an example in this research, were the ones who were in charge of distributional justice in the city in the past. So now we do have a kind of government led arrangement for distribution of water in the city, overlooking the role of those civil society organizations, but also somehow locating marginalized groups like Afghan refugees in Tehran in places that with lack of access to water resources, sufficient water resources, and as well as the informal settlements in Tehran. So we would notice that the problem in Tehran is not only a kind of climatic, geographical climate change, but also a socio-economic pathway in the city. So this is, of course, my invitation is to regenerating a kind of community-based system. I'm not saying this is not to say that we would need MIROP for now, but we do need a kind of civil society organization-based system in place. So this is what I actually mentioned, that, for instance, as a result of my fieldwork with my co-workers, we noticed that there are rich grassroots insight into and resilience, for instance, with regards to flood in the informal settlement. Government doesn't acknowledge such a thing. So these are the things that we suggest, regenerating a kind of multi-dimensional and multi-scale governance arrangement for the water risks and resilience in the city. Over to you. You're on mute, Marco.
Thank you. Sorry, Narges. Thank you for the answer. That was very comprehensive, and I think this is certainly a paper that will develop in the future. Will turn into something very interesting. I'm going to move over swiftly to the next presentation, and this is a presentation by researchers at Brack University. I understand that Taslima is here, although I think it's also see Tasfia here. Hello. So this is an extremely interesting paper that looks at how women without access to productive assets, for example, not protected by legislation, at a high risk of eviction, experience poverty and climate change differently. So as Taslima mentioned, these are women who are often invisible to national policies precisely because of these characteristics. Personally, I think that this is a really interesting case study for international policies that attempt to address both poverty and climate change through, for example, reimbursement and redistribution. So obviously the paper is very much focused on a national policy, which is absolutely right. But I think it's also interesting from an international point of view, where policies, whether national, to be honest, or international, often rely on certain rights, which, as Taslima and her researchers and fellow researchers explained, don't actually apply to the respondents of this research. So it's a great contribution because it highlights the necessity of specific policies to reduce their vulnerability and strengthen their resilience to climate change. So obviously, this is it's an excellent empirical investigation, and it's also thematically very rich. One question I'd like to ask is actually more methodological. So as far as I understand, the paper is part of a piece of research that tries to evaluate a particular policy, a particular national policy. Can you explain a little bit more where you obtained funding and whether this the overall aim of the research influenced the types of questions that you asked? And you basically asked the usual question: if you could go back and interview these women again, are there further or different questions you would ask? Over to you.
Yeah. So hello. So I'll answer the question on behalf of my team. So this research was part of a bigger research project conducted by ODI, and they have seen about what were the impacts of the program interventions among the ultra poor women of the villages that we visited. So the questions were more focused on how their life changed after big, like major or big shocks or events such as like marriage or like the death of a father or husband, and how they rate or how they evaluate their life after and before joining the program. So I think like the interviews that we did with these women were more focused on how their life changed over time. We kind of like got everything that we wanted to know about the program and the impact of it on their lives, but also through the interviews it also like the surface, like how major events like disasters or like how their helplessness have made them more vulnerable to like shocks like disasters or COVID-19 pandemic and such shocks. So one thing that I would probably want to more focus on about the like how prepared they were from the about the disasters from the earlier generations, which surfaced only a little because of the nature of the question, and also like they could not remember well about how their parents or like their guardians used to handle these disasters and stuff, and sometimes their memories also have like betrayed themselves and stuff. So that I think would have been more surfaced if we have interviewed a more older generation, but those are not like in our like survey population, or also they don't fall under the ultra poor population necessarily. So I think that.
Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I mean, obviously the element of intergenerational justice is becoming much more important, obviously. So it's interesting that you thought that was probably the most relevant element to us, just in terms of seeing changes across generations. Okay, I'll move on to the next presentation. So that's the presentation by Vidya Diwakar from the Institute of Development Studies. Apologies if I got your affiliation incorrect. You can correct it if you want now. So this is a paper on inclusive, sustainable economic transformation using aggregate country level data. Specifically, this paper explores advances made in low and middle income countries around economic transformation, social inclusivity, and environmental sustainability. And it does so to understand the synergies and trade-offs between domains and the state of progress since the turn of the century. So I think that given the format of this panel, I'd like to avoid going too much into technicalities of a relatively technical paper, and instead turn to more substantive questions. So one of the reviewers asked if there was a case to be made for more sustainable forms of economic growth or transformation with inclusive social policies across all countries, rather than waiting for poverty and economic growth. And so having reached a certain level. So the question can almost be interpreted as a critique of the kind of donut economics framework that we've had, and that's kind of very much dominated the conversation around these themes, developed by economists such as Kay Rayworth. I think my question would be, from what your paper results show, is it possible to achieve inclusive social policies? So, for example, decrease poverty and inequality without seeing substantial environmental degradation? And what are the challenges with answering this question? We know that there are, the ethical answer is much more straightforward than the methodological one. But I'd like to dwell specifically on what your initial analysis shows you in terms of that kind of trade-off.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question, Marco. And I think the short answer is that yes, it is possible, because if we look at the carbon implications and some work that we're continuing with the ODI Nexus, that I am rightly now affiliated with IDS, if we consider the carbon implications of decent living standards, what we see from some of that work is that the implications of people under the poverty line, the carbon footprints are quite minimal. So even if you are to go, say, from living in the bottom quintile or the bottom 50% of the population in many low-income countries, for example, to a subsequent income or wealth quintile, the implications that has on the carbon footprint, again, are very minimal. So with that in mind, there is scope to significantly improve living conditions, to improve people's well-being and welfare more generally without compromising on environmental footprints. Instead, where the large footprints is when you consider the other side of the spectrum. High income countries, especially high consumption segments within these countries. So here's where a lot of the change needs to also be happening from an equity perspective to really enable better well-being across the distribution in a more holistic sense.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for that. And just for maybe those who haven't had time to get acquainted with the paper, this is not a paper that tries to project or predict the change in carbon emission. The conclusions that you're drawing are from actual trajectories of countries. So you can actually see you're analyzing their environmental impact as they move, as their kind of percentage of poor people or inequality using the World Bank poverty line changes. So it's not necessarily I mean, obviously there are always methodological problems in measuring these things, but this is not this is doable or not. The conclusions that you're making are from actual empirical data and trajectories. Obviously, for many countries, we're still at the beginning of this trajectory, but you're finding some, that the kind of inclusive social policies are achievable without overreaching, as we often talk about.
Yeah, definitely. And just to very briefly comment back on that as well, I think there's quite a bit of value in disaggregating on two levels. One, in terms of country income groups, as we do in the analysis. And secondly, also within countries, looking at different consumption segments, for example, if we're interested in understanding welfare implications and so on. So that within and between country aspects also are quite significant to consider when assessing the implications of poverty reduction and the environmental footprints and so on associated with this.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you, Preeti. Okay, I'll move on swiftly to the next presentation. That's by Sam Pickard and Alberto Lemma from the ODI. And it's, as far as I understand, it's part of the same project that video was involved in. So this is a paper that comes from the same project, but takes quite a different approach by drawing on three case studies. So it explores how government planning in 3 middle-income countries evolved to interweave the three nexus: economic, social, environmental policy goals. So I think I'd like to ask the same question to you, Sam, and whether your more in-depth studies may make us understand better whether it's possible to achieve a triple win outcome. And if not, what are the main obstacles? Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Marco. Theoretically, I think the answer is probably, in short, yes. I think these have been quite well articulated. That was something that was certainly to me that was quite surprising. So these three countries were picked because they were front runners that came out of Vidya's analysis. So we thought that these were probably something where we could learn something from countries that had been through some of this transition. And it certainly was the case that at some point in the last 10 to 20 years, there'd been a real reckoning with previous development pathways, what had been the failures in those and who had lost from those, and setting this very fundamental change to sort of like pathways going forward. quite clearly articulated in some respects, like the trade-offs, the synergies, the need to have these discussions, and the power balances between different parts of government. They exist, and they are documented to different degrees in sort of government documentation. But what we haven't seen, and as Vidya pointed out, is that despite the fact that they've been in place for 10, 20 years, we don't see the outcomes. We don't see the outcomes that they envisage. And it seems that even though these seem to have buy-in from like central government, like a Prime Minister's office, President's office, like a cross-ministry task force, there's still something that is lacking to get from that policy articulation and sort of like promulgation to policy implementation. We deliberately stopped our research before sort of like up until 2019, because it seems like it's going to be a fairly big sort of reset, I suppose, in how policy is set going forward. But I think it's, I found the work quite encouraging, actually, having spent most of the, like, in that these things have been articulated for a long time. There's quite large buy-in and quite large support, and it comes from a very broad set of constituencies. I'm sorry, there's always background noise here, isn't there? I apologize. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sam. Yeah, we could have done with fireworks like in your presentation, but this time it's just background noise. Yes, thank you for that. I think maybe like a further question for both Vidya and yourself might be how much your analysis is subject to the criticism that we often have, where the environmental impacts that we measure is not really a result of the consumption of the country itself, but it's the result of consumption from basically external countries, often rich countries from the north, that kind of increase their environmental impact. I mean, in a way, given your relatively positive results, if anything, that suggests that it's these kind of nexus or triple win policies are even more doable, if that is the criticism. But how, maybe particularly looking at case studies, how much do you think that has influenced your results or what you've seen?
Vidya, do you want to go first?
I'm happy for you to go, Sam. I think it was on the case studies more so please go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's particularly relevant for the 3 case studies because all underwent economic transformations that were focused on export-led growth. So Dominican Republic and Sri Lanka in particular, and to some extent in Thailand, these were focused on garments as well. And then you've seen subsequent economic transformations, but again, it's largely been based on sort of like selling to like exports of foreign markets. An interesting point, I suppose, is that we've really seen you see like a real uptick in sort of particularly CO2 emissions in Thailand, but you don't really see it so much in somewhere like Sri Lanka. And a lot of that is to do with the way that the power sector was developed. A lot of it is also to do with the civil conflict and the way that hampered economic transformation. But for example, in Sri Lanka, the first fossil fuel electricity generation only started to come online in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Before that, the electricity grid was mainly hydropower. So you still see a lot of development in terms of economic development, but it didn't have the same sort of carbon intensity as in Thailand, where a lot of it was developed on sort of coal, or into Dominican Republic, where there's a lot of heavy fuel oil. So you start having to look really quite deeply into the sectors to start unpicking those things.
That's really interesting, Sam. Thank you. Yes, I mean, and that provides a counter argument to this idea of overall homogeneous trajectories, when often we talk about whether we're overreaching or not, and whether we will. So that's really great. Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to kind of provide some initial questions, and now I'd like to open it to the floor. If anyone has any questions, that is both presenters, who I believe constitute anyway the majority of the people here today anyway, but also other people who have managed to attend on a Friday. So if you have any questions, if you want to raise your hand, using the tools. If that tool doesn't appear on this, which might indeed be the case, please just feel free to just unmute yourself and go ahead and let's see how that goes. Tasfia, yes, would you like to go forward?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask Ms. Jivdar about her presentation about Tehran's water system, management system. So what I wanted to, it's a very like basic question, like, is the water supply and the drainage or sewerage system is managed under the same authority or they're like different? Because the particular like suburban area that you mentioned was very at risk of like flood and inundation, and also there are also you mentioned that there like if there is a possible drought or water scarcity, they are the one that's gonna be feel like they're the one that's who's gonna be left behind. So yeah, so I was what I wanted to know is their main issue is with flood and inundation, or about like are they currently facing water scarcity as of now?
Thank you for the question. I would say that my research would discuss both the water scarcity in terms of drought and flood events, which I consider both as water-related climate shocks in Tehran. And the places that I talked about in my research, like the informal settlements and the areas which are actually being managed informally and would subject to climate impacts, are the at-risk areas. This is a little bit complicated. They are, of course, being managed and governed under a comprehensive urban plan imposed by the government and Tehran municipality. But the point is, some of those areas are the ones who are not being acknowledged by the governments. The informal settlements are being overlooked, and they say that, for instance, they don't even exist. Or if you want to provide support, this is only the international organization which would suggest that we should, for instance, concentrate on those areas. But I also mentioned in my research that there are limited data on those areas, and this is what I would suggest to further discuss and further conduct research on. But your point is interesting in a sense that yes, they are the areas that are being overlooked, but they supposed to be governed under the same governance arrangements, which is not being done properly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rajesh, for the question. If I may ask, so I understand that your affiliation is with the United Nations. Is that right? And are these calls for collection of data and information being answered at all? Did you have any further plans? I mean, even just in terms of the discussion, the facilitation between authorities and communities on water governance is certainly one thing that would be probably very beneficial. Are there any developments that you see in the future, or how do you think this will develop?
Yeah. Yes. Actually, for instance, I was part of a country-wide survey regarding climate gaps, and we invited all those authorities from 5 sectors, government authorities, I mean, the academia, civil society organizations, and a private sector to provide input into such program, which, to be honest, is a little bit no-go area for the government in Iran, but we are trying to conduct some initial analysis regarding the gaps. For instance, gaps in climate investment in those areas. But the point is, lack of data is always the biggest challenge for us in order to conduct any kind of interventions. This is why I would invite, for instance, civil society organizations who are in a better place to collect data in the informal settlement, for instance. But yes, this is something that we are trying and we are hopeful to conduct more research on and more intervention on.
Any other questions? No? Okay.
Well, I'd be interested to hear perhaps from from Taslima and Tasfia about what might have been some of the unexpected findings as they were doing this analysis, in terms of whether there were perhaps certain areas where the women in ultra poverty were in fact being recognized already in certain policies. Where did the surprising findings emerge in your analysis?
Okay, thank you, Vidya. I will answer this. The surprising fact was that though the existing policies talk about the gender issue, like women inclusion in the local level implementation, like Union Disaster Management Committee or Voluntary Committee, but if we consider our experience at the field, what we saw that the ultra-poor women are so vulnerable and so left behind by the community or the authority, that they don't have the ability or don't have the confidence to engage themselves with the community in groups or other activities which the government implemented for this community to fight against the climate shocks. So that makes us really wonder that they are also women, and they generally, if we think that these women must included on the community-based government initiatives, but in reality, there was none of the women we interviewed are actually a member of the community disaster management committee or any voluntary work. They are struggling with their day-to-day to meet their basic needs like food, shelter, and all these things. And so the government's policy was, and another thing was also the government's mostly focus on the emergency food assistance during and after the disaster. But we feel during our research that these women needs more than the emergency assistance. They need to multidimensional approaches, like in the study we work with Navojatra, there was literacy training on financial management or some household income generating activities, and also there was disaster management training. So we saw that government have initiatives or program, but they don't have multi-dimensional programs. So all these aspects makes us little shocked, or that's all.
Perhaps a quick, oh no, Sam has his hand up. Go ahead, Sam, I won't. Well, just a quick follow-up, I suppose, also then. In Bangladesh, of course, there's the LDC graduation status coming up in 2026. And so I was curious to understand, do you see scope for optimism in terms of a more open space towards these types of policies, recognizing this upcoming date at which Bangladesh is expected to graduate from the least developed countries list? Or do you still feel that there isn't the space or appetite to take on these issues more, in more depth?
Thank you, Vidya. Absolutely, we think that there is a space, and also we feel that the existing policy can do or can work for to make life better for these women, like the disaster management committee or other thing. Along with it, some mm, mm, skill development program, or make that other poor women more confident about their ability. So with integration, this type of program with existing program government are currently implementing in local level will be helpful for these women.
Thanks a lot, Taslima.
Can I jump in as well as a follow-up question? It slightly builds on what Nadia was saying about Tehran. I think most of your analysis relates to national scale policy. And I'm wondering if, do you think there's an opportunity for something that is in between, where I see like the sort of the research advocacy, which I think you're doing very well, and you're making the case very clearly that the more support is needed for these women, but is there like a middle level? Is there a local level government or a local level CSO that that if the national government isn't able to provide this or isn't willing to, is there a step in between that could advance this, you think?
If I understood, you want me to provide more elaboration if there is an intention from the government towards development of such, for instance, engagement, or this is not part of the plan. But yeah, it's a little bit, I know there are politics, of course, involved in the management of particularly water resources in Iran, which I may refer to, and I may elaborate more on in my research when I want to provide details regarding the policy making arrangements I noted. Yeah, I would go through it in more details, and of course I've done some research in this regard as well, but I was thinking that this is not in the scope of this research. For instance, providing background on policy making arrangements from for instance, after the revolution in Iran, which had a great impact on, for instance, the water resource management. This is actually part of another research I've done, but I was thinking that maybe I can, for instance, put some part of it into this research as well. Thank you for the point.
That's great. Thank you very much. Could I ask almost the same question of the Bangladesh study in that case as well? Like, what you're saying there is that, you know, there are these links between different aspects of government, and then I don't know if you remember the original question, Tasfir or Taslima, like if you want me to repeat it, but is there somewhere in between, like an in between level of government that could be helping these ultra poor women as well in Bangladesh?
So I want to answer this question. So like there are already some disaster management committees and union committees, and also in the like southwestern region, since that is more cyclone prone area, so there are some cyclone preparedness program, and they have like the committees in every like administrative or like unit, like in a village or in a union or in a district or upazila level. So what we wanted to suggest is that, like, rather than how the program actually did, like they arrange like multiple meetings and sessions with these ultra poor women to make them aware about these issues. And not only the participants, their neighbors also got like aware about those issues. So what we wanted to suggest is that a more like participatory approach in the disaster preparedness, rather than only supporting them after the disaster has already happened, or just giving them like emergency relief support. We wanted to what we wanted to suggest is that utilize these existing committees and like network, and make them more make them reach out to these ultra poor women or the marginalized portion of the community, so that they also come around and voice out their concerns, what they're feeling that they're lacking.
Thank you very much for that answer, Tasfia. Okay, unless are there any other questions before we close? Because it's 12:32. In theory, we are meant to close down now. Any other questions? No. In which case, thank you all very much for contributing to this. If you haven't received feedback from me, you'll receive it today or early next week. And I do really hope that this has been a useful exercise, and hopefully this will turn into an interesting issue for the journal. If you so wish, if you want to contribute to the journal, obviously no obligation there. Yes, great. This has been great. Have a nice Friday or whatever day or hour it is over there, and I'll hope to hear from you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. The plenary starts at 1 p.m. So in case you want to join, please do so at 1 in half an hour. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.